had two very different dogs that we decided to take to obedience school. Now, one was a hound that was very lively and bouncy, as they tend to be, and the other was a spaniel that was quiet and clingy, sort of like Tigger and Eeyore. We hoped that we could calm the first one down and maybe bring the second one out of her shell. But when we got there, the hound was so excited to see new dogs and new people that he couldn't concentrate. And Eeyore decided to keep her head down, and she just butted anything that got in her way. Well, sometimes when you try to teach something, it just makes it worse. You have to try a new approach. You can teach an old dog new tricks if you just know how. And most of the training books out there don't work because the dogs have never read them. Now, in the Old Testament reading from Jeremiah, the people are receiving a new covenant. Why a new one? Because they broke the last one, and the one before that, and the one before that, and on and on. No, they're not stupid. They're just very human. Jeremiah is trying to call them back to faithfulness, to their belief in the God of Israel. Just as God brought their ancestors through the wilderness into the promised land, God will bring them on a new exodus back to Israel from Babylon. Now, convincing them of this is not going to be easy. Their temple in Jerusalem had been destroyed by the Babylonian invaders. The treasures have been taken away, including the Holy of Holies, on which the Ten Commandments have been written. No wonder they are discouraged and disheartened. You can only live in poverty and drudgery for so long before you begin to wonder, why me? Why are the oppressors living the good life? Well, Jeremiah promises them that better days are coming. The new covenant is going to be written on their hearts, where no one can break in and steal them. No matter how many times they break this covenant, and there will be many, God's forgiveness and God's relationship with God's people will never end. Well, I could use a word of encouragement like that. Every day, the world seems to be getting a little bit crazier. Whether you're looking at any topic, environment, politics, civilization, you gotta wonder if we are actually moving backwards. Now, none of us can fix the world, but maybe we can improve just our little corner of it. As for the state of the world, well, God's seen a lot worse and keeps on believing in us. In Paul's letter to the Hebrews, he is also offering encouragement to people who no longer have the physical reminder of God's love. Jesus has risen, ascended to heaven, and is going to return. But when? Paul argues that Jesus the Christ is our eternal high priest. Like the priests of old, he is our intercessor with God, who makes sacrifices on our behalf. But why do we need a high priest? Wasn't his death and resurrection enough? The priesthood of Jesus is of a higher order. He says that Jesus' priesthood is like that of Melchizedek. Melchizedek who? You really have to dig to find a reference to this ancient, obscure priest. And even then, what you find is mysterious. In the book of Genesis, Melchizedek was a priest who blessed Abraham long before there was a temple or before there was an ordered priesthood. There's no beginning or end of this priesthood. Therefore, it is eternal. Now, what's troubling about this reading is that it seems to present Jesus as one who needs to learn obedience and to be made perfect. I think too often we think of obedience the way we think of it for my dogs. I wanted them to learn how to sit and stay and come here. Is that the kind of obedience that we want to learn from Jesus? As an embodied person, Jesus needed to learn obedience to God in the same way as the ancient Israelites, in his heart. When we attempt to learn something difficult, we use visual reminders, flashcards, until we've got it by heart. The obedience Jesus learned was the experience of having heart knowledge of God. And to quote one biblical commentator, active obedience is an ongoing and never-ending faithfulness. Active obedience is an ongoing and never-ending faithfulness. Even being the Son of God did not mean that he would have no suffering, tears, or loud cries. We too will have suffering. But what makes it bearable is when our suffering has meaning. Jesus faced his mortality with the same mixed feelings that most of us do. In John 12, he knew his hour was fast approaching. And even though he had the time to offer some lessons to some Greeks who just happened to be there, he felt inner turmoil. He said, "My soul is troubled." Should he ask God to save him? But he knows who he is and whose he is. He makes a request, "Father, glorify your name." Then a voice from heaven speaks, and it sounds like thunder, the same thunder that Moses heard on Mount Sinai. And the voice says, "I have glorified it, and I will glorify it again." From past to present to future, God was glorified in the incarnation of Jesus, and God's name will be glorified again in the resurrection. Now the crowd standing around fails to understand or even to hear this message. They are in between the time of Jesus' life and resurrection. And we too are in between the time of his resurrection and his return at the end of time. Lent is a time when we can experience time as both here and now and not quite yet. In the meantime, we are here to learn obedience and humility. We can't raise ourselves up. Even Jesus couldn't resurrect himself. It is only God who rules both life and death, who can bring life out of death. We are like the grain of wheat that has no control over whether it falls into the earth or not. Living takes place in the everyday muck and mire, not in some celestial realm. The good news is that we will not be left stuck in the mud. God accepts us as we are, but loves us too much to leave us that way. When Paul wrote that Jesus had been made perfect, he wasn't implying that Jesus had been imperfect. The word used for perfect also means complete. We are not yet complete, but in Jesus we are made complete. As we look forward to Easter, we anticipate our completion. Thanks be to God. Amen.